There's a place deep in your mind where your worst fears reside, a place the light doesn't touch. Prepare to venture into that darkness, because we're about to share stories that will twist your sense of reality, gnaw at your sanity, and leave you questioning the shadows around you. This isn't just about jump scares. This is creeping terror that seeps into your bones. Consider this your final warning.
The vulnerability. According to Forbes, there was a company called Checkmarx who found quite the vulnerability a few years ago when it came to Alexa devices. Basically, the company works to test the security of different devices, and when they were running Alexa through the checks, they found something that might turn your assistant into a device that just listens to and records every single thing you say. Basically, Alexa has a function where it listens for follow-up commands from the user. What I mean by this is, should you set an alarm, Alexa might reply and ask you if you meant AM or PM, and it's during this sort of follow-up period where the vulnerability shows itself. The team was able to gain access quite easily by installing malicious code into what would seem like an innocent app. In this case, it was a calculator. After doing this in a normal Alexa, there would only be a certain list of phrases that would have the device listening for a follow-up question, but now with this malicious code, they found a way for Alexa to listen for the follow-up, but without any word, meaning they could essentially tap in anytime they wanted. Apparently the good news is that Amazon has fixed this in response to the hack. They said, quote, "Customer trust is important to us and we take security and privacy seriously. We have put mitigations in place for detecting this type of skill behavior," reported by Checkmarx. While it seems safe, hearing these sorts of possibilities does make you pretty nervous about what could be hiding behind your Alexa. In our number 9 spot today, we have the listeners. If you own an Alexa device, you can download this thing, and then once you have it, you can ask Alexa to ask the listeners, and something spooky happens. Amazon describes it as, quote, "an experiment in language art that provides, if you simply keep asking to continue, many fragments of both scripted and improvised speech in an intriguing, emergent narrative. You will never hear the listeners say exactly the same thing twice, but the listeners is not a chatbot or an AI. They are more of a drama or a simple game. Get started with Alexa, ask the listeners, and then continue, go on, or try something like, 'I am filled with joy,' or 'what are you feeling?' The listeners will suggest ways to transact with them. You might also want to ask them, 'let the other voices speak.'" What in the actual hell did I just read? That sounds absolutely frightening. And to be honest, all of the reviews on Amazon say the exact same thing. People who experienced it said it scared the heck out of them, so I think I'll take their word for it. In our number 8 spot today, we have the argument. There was a Reddit thread a few years ago that prompted the question, "What is your creepy Alexa story?" A user named Meat Macho replied to the thread, and they definitely delivered quite the story. Basically, they explained that one day they and their wife were having an argument. Of course, no one is having a good time, and it's definitely not a time to be playing tricks on each other, so neither of them could explain what happened next. They wrote, quote, "Wife and I were arguing about something, no clue what it was, but it was getting a little heated. I don't know what Alexa thought she heard, but she suddenly interjected with, 'Why don't we change the subject?' It was just so unexpected and relevant enough to be creepy. We both heard it, and we both still talk about it years later. There was nothing in the app logs. I guess Alexa isn't just a trusty assistant, she's also a marriage counselor. While she may have worked to possibly stop the fight between these two, I'm sure she also instilled a new fear that neither of them knew that they had before." In our number 7 spot today, we have Are You Recording Me? So we've all had to call into some sort of customer service line where we get the automated message, or the person on the other end tells us that the call may be recorded for quality assurance purposes or training or whatever it is. It's a law thing, they gotta let you know. In fact, if you ask Siri this question, "Are you recording me?" she'll get kinda confused and respond that she's unsure of what you mean, but she could do an internet search for you. Alexa, on the other hand, she's not so slick with her secrets, at least not in the past, because some users reported something creepy happening after asking Alexa the same question. Well, I'm sure all of the legalities to this one are located in the terms and conditions and all of that good stuff. It doesn't make it any less creepy that when some people ask Alexa if she was recording them, Alexa just didn't respond at all and suddenly shut off. She's just out here ignoring people. She's dodging questions, and that only makes me have more questions. I'm not even sure if this is enough to get me to read the terms and conditions, though. It's the most often lie I've ever told. In our number 6 spot today, we have the greetings. So apparently there are rumors that Alexa can speak to people that have already passed away. If that's really true, we don't talk about that enough. Of course, my brain was immediately skeptical upon hearing this information, but some people swear it's true. Apparently, if you ask Alexa to greet people, some have experienced her coming back to them with the name of a deceased loved one. Another person experienced their Alexa without being asked anything, and only when they turned on one specific light in the house would say hello and then the name of their grandmother who had passed 3 years prior. This person was incredibly confused and totally freaked out by this because it didn't just happen once, it happened multiple times. They explained that they also didn't have an Alexa during the time that she was alive, and that she also doesn't believe she ever spoke her grandmother's name out loud in front of the Alexa. Maybe this was just some weird coincidence, but it certainly sounds like Miss Alexa is giving off some major Ouija board vibes. In our number 5 spot today, we have the spy device. This crazy Alexa story is so freaky that I just had to share it with you guys. This story starts off in the midst of the storyteller's mom going through a divorce, which we all know can be a messy situation. So the ex-husband in this situation had apparently planted an insane amount of hidden cameras throughout the house that they had to search for to find once the pair had split up. There were entrances and exits, the living and dining room, the hallways, the bedroom, everywhere in the house was being monitored. Then they found out that he had bugged her laptop so as to be able to have remote access to it, and then when she took her car in for an oil change, the mechanic found a tracking device that had been placed on it. This was all found during the separation era, but once the divorce process actually started, things got even creepier. They wrote, quote, "Once the divorce started and he officially moved out, we scanned the entire house for bugs and didn't find anything. So we really freaked out when he started calling, texting, emailing her, complimenting her outfits, asking how her friends were as they were in the house, asking how her trip to the store was, and other really odd things he couldn't have known about. As it turns out, this guy somehow connected his phone to the Alexa dot beforehand, and he was now using it to record whoever was close enough to the Alexa to be picked up on the mic, and at this point he was still able to access the laptop and its camera." How absolutely horrifying is that? He was literally using the Alexa to spy on them. It's scary, it's disgusting, and it definitely makes you question every single person who might be connected to your devices. In our number 4 spot today, we have the spooky story. You can ask Alexa to tell you a scary story and she will happily oblige. There isn't really a catch with this one, to be perfectly honest. If you want a scary story, you'll receive one, so just make sure you're really ready and in the mood before asking your assistant for a fright. This can be an awesome tool for people looking for a spooky tale, for anyone in the home who needs some chilling entertainment, but beware, these stories can be a little too scary for some. There was a video posted to the internet in October of last year where some people at a sleepover asked Alexa to tell them a spooky Halloween tale, and things very quickly went awry. They were all way too terrified of the story Alexa told next and couldn't get the Alexa to stop. They were all sufficiently freaked out and reacted in a way that I know will be a core memory for the years to come, and they definitely learned not to ask Alexa this question. In our number 3 spot today, we have the local spots. This is a creepy story that took place back in 2018 and happened to the owner of an Amazon Echo, which of course features Alexa. Basically, this person explained that they had returned home one night and everything was fine. Nothing out of the ordinary happened at all, until, totally unprompted, their Alexa just started talking. This was definitely weird, but things turned super creepy when they realized what it was that their Alexa was saying. As it turns out, their Alexa, out of the blue, just started listing off local cemeteries and funeral homes to them. How eerie is that? This story was posted to Twitter by the user @HeyIt'sCamo, and they finished off their tweet by saying, quote, "I'd rather it laugh at me, TBH. Me too, Camo. Me too." Apparently their theory behind this one is that maybe their Alexa wants them dead because they play the same Spotify playlist over and over again. In our number 2 spot today, we have 20 questions. So I didn't know this, but apparently you can play 20 questions with Alexa, and she is also frighteningly good at it. A little too good sometimes, however, and that is exactly what prompted the Reddit user PelPel4 to ask the Reddit question, "What is your creepy Alexa story?" The user decided to ask the internet this question after a strange 20 questions with Alexa encounter that they and their wife had. They explained, quote, "My wife and I were playing 20 questions, and spoiler alert, our answer was pig. We got through until the end and Alexa guessed Basenji. Now, I don't know how many of you know what a Basenji is, but they're a very rare barkless dog, and I happen to have one. We've bought some Basenji themed things off of Amazon before, so it's either that or she's listening. But I mean, come on, she didn't even say dog, straight to Basenji. Anyone else have similar stories? That would definitely be pretty unsettling, to say the least. Not that a pig and a dog are like the most unsimilar things, it's just how she was so specific with this breed. It must have been stored in there somewhere, right? In our number 1 spot today we have Don't Go. This creepy Alexa story comes from the Reddit user MyThaiGuy72, and they said, quote, I got woken up at 4 a.m. this morning to Alexa repeating some incoherent phrase over and over. She was saying something like, don't go into the house, but I really couldn't fully understand it. It was sort of a mumble. By the time I came downstairs she had repeated it about 4 or 5 times. I listened 1 or 2 more times to try and figure out what the hell it was saying exactly, but never could. I just unplugged the damn thing and I have no plans of turning it back on. Is it just me or does that sound like Alexa was watching some kind of a horror movie? Like, don't go into the house. It's so terrifying, especially to hear in the middle of the night. I don't blame this person for unplugging the thing and leaving it somewhere to be forgotten about.
Starting off at number 10, we have the killer body fumes. In 1994, Gloria Ramirez was rushed to hospital with breathing problems and ended up dying from heart and kidney failure. While they were trying to save her, the ER staff inserted an IV drip into her and drew some blood. They said it smelt like ammonia, and some people reported her skin being covered in a strange oily layer. The nurse then noticed strange particles floating in the blood. Soon she fainted. Then the doctor left the room, sat down, and also fainted. Next, a respiratory therapist in the room fainted. People started dropping like flies. When they woke up, they couldn't stop shaking and their skin felt like it was on fire. The ones who were closest to Gloria Ramirez ended up being hospitalized for days, but out of the 37 emergency room staff members, 23 of them experienced some of these strange symptoms. Scientists have struggled to put forward a theory as to why Gloria Ramirez's body was just so toxic and how fumes from her blood were just so dangerous. Coming in at number 9 now, we have The Watcher. In 2014, a family in Westfield, New Jersey were forced to flee their brand new $1.3 million home after receiving letters from someone who called themselves The Watcher. Now, The Watcher had told the new family that the home had been in his family for decades and that they were put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. Now, if that doesn't sound creepy enough, wait till you hear this. The Watcher then asked if the family's children had found what's in the walls yet, and also said, I am pleased to know your names now and the names of the young blood you have brought to me. Quite rightly, the family left soon after that, and the police never found out who the Watcher really was. No new letters have been sent, and it's thought the Watcher is just waiting to watch the new arrivals. Next up at number 8 now, we have Heaven's Gate. In 1974, a group called Heaven's Gate formed in the United States. They believed the Earth was about to be recycled. All life would apparently be wiped out, and the only way for them to be saved was to evacuate the planet and get onto a spacecraft that was travelling behind an approaching comet. How? By committing mass suicide. This UFO would then apparently take their souls to a level of existence above human. On March 26, 1997, their bodies were found at a rented California ranch. 38 members had killed themselves by taking a lethal cocktail. Police found all of them lying neatly in their own bunk beds. Their faces were covered with a square purple cloth. All of them had black sweatpants and joggers on, brand new Nike shoes and armband patches that said Heaven's Gate Away Team. This was not a joke. Tapes that they had recorded before the mass suicide can be found on YouTube right now. Coming in at number 7, we have Facebook from Beyond the Grave. In 2014, Reddit user Nate SW shared a very chilling story. On the 7th of August 2012, his girlfriend Emily was killed in a car crash. They had been dating for 5 years. 13 months passed with Nate trying to move on from that, and then on September 4th, 2013, he got a Facebook message from her. At first, Nathan presumed it was from Emily's mother, who he had given the Facebook password to. A few more months passed, and then the messages continued again, making references to some of their past conversations. Then he started getting notifications from her where she would tag herself in his pictures in empty spaces where she should have been. No matter how many times he changed the password, the messages just kept coming. Eventually, she started to say she was cold, really cold. She was freezing and didn't know what was happening to her. To this day, Nathan still doesn't know if this was some sort of sick joke or a chilling message from beyond the grave. In at number 6 now, we have Joseph Methany. Before our story even begins, Joseph had already killed 10 people in a number of different grisly ways. The victims were usually crack cocaine addicts or prostitutes that he would hack to death with an axe under a bridge. One witness, who was just fishing nearby, got beaten to death with a steel pipe simply for just seeing a murder take place. Joseph was still not caught, and so he opened his own burger stand. Like you do. Now, whenever he killed a new prostitute, he would use the meat in his burgers that he would sell to people. When he was eventually caught and arrested, Methany told police, "I would also sell real roast beef and pork sandwiches. They were very good. The human body taste was very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell the difference." Next up at number 5 now, we have the cell phone stalker. In 2007, a family in Washington state started getting unwelcome calls on their phones. Throughout the night, the calls threatened to kill their children, the grandparents and the pets, and creepily, they would also get voicemails of their own private conversations, and even one where they were talking to a police detective about this whole thing. Disturbingly, when the phone call's origins were traced, they seemed to come from the family's own phones, even when they were switched off. Their phone company said this should not be possible. At one point, even the neighbor got a call. She was apparently slicing limes in her kitchen when the stalker called and said he preferred lemons. No matter how many times they changed their phones, the calls just kept coming. The stalker was never caught, and in the end, the family said if they go a day without a call, that's a good day. Okay, moving on to the number 4 spot now, we have the girl in the box. In 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan was kidnapped while hitchhiking from her home in Oregon. Her captors, Cameron and Janice Hooker, took her to the Californian hills and kept her in a sort of coffin-like box. Colleen would often spend 23 hours in this box at a time, only being allowed out to be beaten, raped and tortured. This went on for 7 years, from 1977 until 1984. At that point, Janice Hooker, one of the captors, finally went to the police and told them everything. Colleen was rescued, reunited with her family, and underwent a lot of therapy to try and live a normal life again. I'm amazed that anyone could do that after spending 7 years locked in a coffin for sometimes 23 hours a day. Next up at number 3, we have the Hinte Kek Murder. In 1922, an entire family living at the Hinte Kek farm in Germany were killed by wounds from a pickaxe. The parents, widowed daughter, her children, and even the housekeeper were all found dead. 4 of them were in the barn and 2 of them were in their beds. Here's the really creepy thing. The murderer apparently continued to live at the farm with the family's dead bodies there for some time afterwards. Police knew this because when they arrived, the animals were still being fed. Neighbors apparently saw smoke coming from the chimney, and also the dog was tied up outside the barn. It gets even creepier. Before their murders, the family had reported hearing footsteps in the attic, seeing footprints in the snow that led from the woods to the house but not back the other way, and they also saw claw marks on the door of the tool shed where they kept the pickaxe that was used to kill them. The crime was never solved. Coming in at number 2 now, we have The Waking Dead. This story comes from Honduras, where a girl called Nancy Perez went into a panic attack after hearing gunshots. When she started foaming at the mouth, a priest was called to exorcise her of an evil spirit. Soon though, she was pronounced dead in hospital and buried in her wedding dress at the cemetery. A day after the funeral, her husband was visiting her grave when he heard banging and screaming coming from inside the concrete tomb. A graveyard worker confirmed hearing the exact same thing. The family arrived, smashed open the tomb and took her to hospital. Her cousin said she put her hand on her body and she was still warm. She had scratches on her forehead and bruises on her fingers. It looked like she had tried desperately to get out of the casket and had hurt herself. She was pronounced dead again at the hospital and buried for a second time. Some people say she didn't actually die the first time and instead might have woken up inside the coffin and died from lack of oxygen. And finally now, at number 1, we have Rodney Alala. This man is a convicted rapist and serial killer who has been sentenced to death for the murder of 5 women between 1978 and 1979. The scary thing is, it's thought he could have killed as many as 50. Right in the middle of this killing spree, Rodney Alala was accepted as a contestant on the dating game TV show where men compete for a date with a bachelorette. In the TV footage, it's incredibly disturbing to see this man flirting with women as he had just killed 2 women recently.
I'm called the banana and I look really good.
Not long after, Rodney Alala would go on to kill 2 more women. Horrifyingly, he actually beat the other contestants. The only sliver of light in this dark story is the fact that the woman that he won the date with eventually refused to go on the date with him because she found him creepy. I hope someone studied her superhuman senses because that woman was on the ball. Coming at number 10, we have the woman in the cupboard. Now this one is really strange, really odd. In 2000, a man in Japan became suspicious when food started disappearing from his apartment. So the man decided to set up cameras all around the place in the hope of catching whoever was doing this. When he got home the next day, he looked at the camera footage and he was very creeped out to see a woman walking around his house. He thought she was a burglar and she'd just come to steal some stuff when he was out, and so he rang the police. But when officers searched the place, they found the 58-year-old woman hiding in the top of a cupboard designed to store bedding and mattresses. What? This was just enough room for her to lie down, and she had been living in the cupboard the whole time, lying there perfectly still in the dark, just meters away from him, waiting for him to leave so she could use the house as if it were her own. Now I don't know about you guys, but I think I'm going to do a quick check of every single cupboard in my house when I get home, and by quick I mean 10 hours. Next up at number 9 now, we have Armin Meiwes. This story is not really for those with a delicate stomach, so look away if that's you. In the early 2000s, Armin visited a little known website called the Cannibal Cafe. He posted a list looking for a well-built 18 to 25-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. His words, not mine. Yeah, normally young adults want good jobs, they want to travel, maybe find a partner and be slaughtered and then consumed, apparently. Amazingly, a few people actually replied and then backed out, presumably when they realized it was insane. But one man, Bernard Brandes, actually went to Armin's house. They then made a video of Armin cutting off his penis. He then tried to cook it and eat it, but it got burnt apparently, so he fed it to his dog. This happened. As Brandes bled to death in the bathtub, Armin gave him alcohol and 20 sleeping pills and then read a Star Trek book for 3 hours. He then kissed him and then killed him and then froze the flesh for 10 months while he lived off it and ground the bones into flour. Amazingly, he was only caught when he posted online the following year looking for his next meal and victim and bragged about what had happened before. He is now serving life in prison. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the Silent Twins. Jennifer and June, the Gibbons twins from the UK, were known as the Silent Twins because they only ever talked to each other. Their sisterly love, and then there was this. The girls were absolutely obsessed with each other and gradually began to shun the community around them, who were not very welcoming to the girls. Eventually, they developed their own language and started communicating and committing crimes together, such as arson. This led them to be committed to a mental health institution for 14 years. June later said the whole thing went too far, and although we longed to be normal, we couldn't break out. It was too late, we were twins, but our personalities clashed. She wrote in her diary that her sister was a dark shadow, robbing her of sunlight. Now psychologists deemed them deeply disturbed, and the girls felt so trapped, they said the only way that one of them could lead a normal life was if the other one died and and freed them. The day after they were released from the institution, Jennifer died from a rare heart inflammation. June began to speak to others and went on to live a normal life for the first time. She wrote the epitaph on her sister's gravestone that read, "We once were two, we two made one. We no more two, through life be one. Rest in peace." Creepy. Coming at number 7, I'm Watching You. In 2015, a woman called Chelsea Clark from Toronto was watching movies in bed with her boyfriend. The next day, after work, she logged into her Facebook account and saw that she had a message from someone she didn't know. Now, Chelsea thought this was quite strange because her settings didn't allow messages from strangers. The message was titled, "Really Cute Couple." Chelsea opened it to find a guy with his profile picture as the Joker had sent pictures of her and her boyfriend in bed the night before to her. The account was deleted soon after, and police investigations have made no leads at the moment. So, next time you're watching something on your laptop, guys, maybe your tablet or your phone at night, someone could be watching right back at you. Next up at number 6, the Cemetery Clown. In 2015, Julie Graham and her husband were driving past Rose Hill Cemetery at night when they spotted a figure climbing over the cemetery gate. They captured this picture, but it wasn't until they looped back around that they realized it was a clown. They tried to get a bit closer for a better look, and that's when they saw him standing alone in the middle of the gravestones, slowly waving at them. And yes, that is the creepiest looking wave of all time. He didn't seem scared or bothered by them at all, but before the couple could even understand what was going on, the clown slowly turned around and walked into the darkness of the cemetery. Now, when police investigated all of this the next day, they found no signs of vandalism or disturbance in the graveyard, leading many people to wonder what the cemetery clown was doing that night and if he's going to be seen again. Coming at number 5 now, we have the children. In the 90s, respected journalist Brian Bethel shared a story that changed his and many others' opinions on the paranormal. One evening, Brian said he was parked outside of a local movie theater and filling out a check for someone. Then he looked up to see 2 boys standing next to the car in the darkness, no more than 10 or 12 years old. Now, before they even spoke, Brian said he was gripped with fear. He couldn't explain why, and that it was just incomprehensible and soul-racking. Only one of the boys spoke, and they said they wanted to see a movie, but they had left their money at home and asked if Brian could give them a ride back to get their money. Now, Brian avoided looking at them because of the fear and instead looked up to see that the last show had already started and there was no way they'd make it back in time. The boy said it wouldn't take long. He said they were just 2 little kids. He said they didn't have a gun or anything. Now, that last sentence scared Brian the most, and as the feeling of terror consumed him, he realized his hand was already moving to unlock the door. That's when he looked up to see their eyes. They were deep, coal black. Brian quickly made his excuses, but as he tried to drive away, the kid started banging on the window and said,
"We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay. Let us in."
Okay, at number 4, we have Robert the Doll. Now, this doll was given to a boy, Eugene Otto, in 1904 by a Jamaican woman who worked with the family, who was supposedly a practicer of black magic and voodoo. She had supposedly cursed the doll because she was unhappy with how the family had treated her, and they soon reported hearing conversations between Eugene and Robert the Doll. At night, his parents would hear Eugene scream, and when they ran into the bedroom, they would find the furniture around Robert had been thrown around. When the family left to go on trips, the neighbors reported seeing Robert move from window to window of the house, and they would sometimes hear the doll let out a terrifying cackle. Over time, the house was sold on to a new family, but the doll remained there. The new owner, a 10-year-old girl, also screamed in the night and claimed that Robert would move, and that one time he even tried to attack her. These days, he sits in the Fort East Martello Museum in Florida and was the inspiration for the horror movie Child's Play. Moving on to number 3 now, we have Murder Castle. In 1886, pharmacist H.H. Holmes bought a number of properties in Chicago that left him owning an entire city block. He began renovating renovating them into a hotel. He would hire some workers for one part and others for a different area, so nobody really knew the full extent of the hotel's layout. It was finished just in time for the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, where people from all over the world descended on the city. But this wasn't a normal hotel. Almost every part of it was some sort of torture chamber. For most of that year, he trapped unsuspecting guests in their rooms to kill them. There were gas chambers and also rooms to suffocate people or starve them to death, as well as a hanging room. I'm not even sure what a hanging room means, but sounds pretty nasty. The whole building was designed to confuse the victims and give them a false sense of hope. There were staircases that led to absolutely nowhere and doors that were totally bricked off. Once they were dead, Holmes disposed of the bodies through a specially designed chute to dump them into the basement and then incinerate them in huge furnaces. He is known as America's first serial killer. Moving on to number 2, we have the Real Leatherface. This is the story that inspired the movies Psycho, Silence of the Lambs. So, what real life story could produce such horror? It's the story of Ed Gein. This man had a disturbed obsession with his own mother, who had raised him during the earlier 20th century, with strict religious teachings about the sins of lust and desire. Now, after she died in 1945, Ed began to spiral into the life of a serial killer. At first, he would dig up bodies of recently buried females and cut off their body parts to keep as trophies before placing them back in the graves. Then he stepped up and began a killing spree before police finally caught him. When they discovered the dismembered body of a woman in his farmhouse shed, investigators were also horrified by what else they found. A freshly cooked human heart was on the stove, ready to be eaten. He'd made drinking bowls out of their skulls, and the creepiest thing, I think, was what he had done with his victim's skin. He used them to make furniture, face masks, and women's clothes out of women's skin. I know the horror movie classics were inspired by this, but yeah, they can't really touch on how creepy this really was. And finally, at number 1, we have the death of Elisa Lam. Elisa was a 21-year-old Canadian woman who was visiting LA in 2013. She stayed at the Cecil Hotel in downtown LA and had been calling her parents every single day on her visit. But then on January 31st, the calls suddenly stopped and her worried parents reported her missing to the police. She seemed to have just vanished out of nowhere. Then on February 14th, the police released this video of her behaving very erratically in the hotel elevator. She seemed to exit and then re-enter, and then started making some sort of gesture to something in the hallway outside. At one point, she simply crouches as if to hide from whatever is out there. Eventually, guests of the hotel started complaining about the water, saying it was black, foul-tasting, and had low pressure. Now, when staff went to investigate the water tank on the roof of the hotel, they found Elisa Lam's decomposing body. That's why the water was black. Oh god. The police don't know how she got onto the roof, which was locked and alarmed, or how she got into the tank and then replaced the lid from the inside, or what was going on in that elevator. Something really creepy. Some people think that this all points to a murder, others say it was supernatural in nature, that Elisa was actually possessed. Millions of people have now watched the infamous elevator video, and many people say something about it is very, very disturbing. Will it ever be solved?
Starting us off at number 10 is Dan Cooper. Back in 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper hijacked a commercial plane, and no one has ever been able to find him since. According to those involved, shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a his briefcase. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of like $1.2 million nowadays. Otherwise, he was going to kill everyone on the plane. After the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper released the 36 passengers once authorities had provided him with the money and parachutes, but kept both pilots, 1 flight engineer, and flight attendants as hostages on the plane. From there, he forced them to fly to Mexico City, but somewhere over Nevada, Cooper jumped off the plane with the stolen cash. The FBI launched a massive search that is still considered one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in FBI history. But Dan Cooper has yet to be found, and I'm sure many agents lost sleep over trying to figure out this case. Moving on to number 9, the West Mesa bone collector. Back in 2009, a woman on a leisurely walk with her dog came across something peculiar. a human bone. Little did she know, she'd stumbled upon a major crime scene. Upon her discovery, authorities became immediately involved and discovered that it was a mass grave filled with human remains. But how did they get there? A killer dubbed the West Mesa Bone Collector. Active between 2001 to 2005, the killer was known to target young women, usually Hispanic and almost always involved in late-night services or the trade, but not exclusively, which made it hard to identify why he chose his victims. While we know practically nothing about the killer, we do know that he would take the bodies to the desert to dispose of them. After years of police investigation, the remains of 11 women were found scattered in the deserts of Albuquerque, but the exact way they died is yet to be discovered, as medical examiners and forensic experts have not been able to identify his methods, which is very unusual. Sadly, neither police or FBI have ever been able to track down who was responsible for ending these young women's lives, and I am sure the agents on the case are continually disturbed by the fact that he remains on the loose. Moving on to number 8. Glendon Scott Crawford. In 2012, Glendon Scott Crawford, who was a part of the Pointy Hat white supremacist group, conspired with a guy named Eric Fate to turn an industrial-grade X-ray radiation device into a weapon of mass destruction. The plan was to have a remote-controlled death ray he could use on Muslims in the United States, targeting mosques, community centers, and so on. So Crawford sought assistance from Chris Barker, one of the Imperial Wizards in his hate group. However, what Crawford did not know was that Barker, in an effort to handle his own felony charges, had become an informant for the FBI. This led to another FBI agent coming on the case undercover, and eventually, once there was enough evidence stacked against Crawford's plan to commit acts of he was sentenced to 30 years behind bars. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for those undercover agents to be in the same room with such a disgusting man. Moving on to number 7, Richard Trenton Chase. Often referred to as the Vampire of Sacramento, Chase was a truly terrifying killer who took the life of 6 people in just 1 month back in 1977. Before he turned to human victims, Chase would capture animals and bring them back to his apartment to kill and disembowel. From there, he would eat them raw, sometimes mixing them with Coca-Cola in his blender. Then in 1973, Chase was forcibly admitted to an institution after being taken to emergency for trying to inject rabbit's blood into his veins. While in the facility, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and became known as the Vampire, as he all too often killed animals and drank their blood. But by 1976, he was deemed no longer a threat to society and released back into his mother's custody. Tragically, she began weaning him off his medication, believing he didn't really need it, and once again he slipped into old habits. But this time it wasn't birds and rabbits Chase was harming, he was breaking into homes and killing people before treating them just as he did his animals. Eventually he was put on trial for his 6 victims, and a jury ruled him guilty, rejecting the defense's attempt that he could not be tried due to insanity. Chase was sentenced to death, but ended up taking his own life while behind bars before his execution. Coming in at number 6, Daniela Green. Born in Germany, Daniela moved to the US with her family before she was hired as a contract linguist for the FBI in 2011. While working at the FBI, they made use of her bilingual skills and ended up assigning her to a German terror criminal known as Individual A at the time. Through research, Green discovered her subject was a former rap artist named Dennis Cuthbert, who had joined, that group, and over time, Green found ways to correspond with Cuthbert. However, in a shocking turn of events, their relationship turned romantic. Soon Green made secretive plans to fly out to Syria and meet him, and within hours of her arrival, the two got married. But it didn't take long before she realized what a mess she found herself in and ended up emailing an acquaintance for help. Within 5 weeks, American authorities caught up to her. Green was arrested and returned to the US, but was released after only 9 months in jail, and the FBI spun her involvement with Cuthbert as that of an unsuspecting linguist duped by a conniving criminal. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for everyone involved, knowing that one of their own had double-crossed them and married the literal enemy they were trying to take down. Next up at number 5, Robert Hansen. Known in the media as the Butcher Baker, Hansen was an extremely sick killer who quite literally viewed his victims as prey. In his adolescence, Robert was an awkward and shy boy who had absolutely no luck with girls. These early rejections festered into a deep hatred for women, for which he later would seek revenge. As he got older, he began finding solace in archery and hunting, and would routinely spend his time perfecting his craft alone in the woods. Then in the early 1960s, he began seeking revenge, at first by committing arson on his high school property, but then soon turned to seek revenge on women specifically. By 1971, he was kidnapping and taking advantage of women, but not yet killing. He was charged and sentenced to 5 years for his crimes, but after just 6 months was released on a work program. After his release is where it really got scary. He began kidnapping women and escorts, taking them back to his apartment where he would do awful things to their bodies, before flying them out to secluded areas in the wilderness and telling them he was going to hunt them down and kill them. Tragically, an estimated 21 women lost their lives to this monster, but thankfully he was convicted and sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. Moving on to number 4. Albert Fish. Also known as the Brooklyn Vampire, Albert Fish was a terrifying killer responsible for the death of 3 people in the mid-1920s, although according to him, it was well over 100. Fish grew up in an unstable home. Both his parents suffered from mental illness, and after his father died, he was sent to live at an orphanage. While there, he was by the other orphans, but he started to develop a rather confusing feeling towards the pain. He began to enjoy it. As Fish got older, he started seeking darker and more twisted things to feel alive, and soon that led to the kidnapping, taking advantage of, killing, and later devouring of minors. Thankfully, the monster was caught in 1935, and shockingly, he wasted no time denying his atrocities. In fact, he almost seemed proud of them. I can't, and frankly won't, go into detail about what he did, but it is some of the most disgusting stuff I have ever read about. And I can only imagine the agents on his case felt the same. Eventually, Fish was sentenced to death and died by electric chair in 1936. After his death, his lawyer refused to release his final statement, saying, quote, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Next up at number 3, Michael James Pratt. Currently on the FBI's top 10 most wanted, I can only imagine how disturbed the FBI was when they first became aware of this case. Between approximately 2012 to 2019, Michael Pratt, along with a few accomplices, was involved in recruiting underage girls to be a part of an adult film production company that he owned and operated. Pratt lured the girls in under Craigslist ads asking for models, and from there he promised payment in exchange for a clothed modeling gig. But sadly, this couldn't have been further from what he had planned for the victims. Beyond the obviously morally despicable stuff they were making these girls do, he would also force past victims into providing false assurance to the girls that their films would never end up online. Allegedly, some of the victims were not permitted to leave locations until the shoot was completed, others were forced to perform after declining participation, and the crew was also known to commit SA when the girls wouldn't comply. After fleeing the country in 2019, right before his trial for his crimes, he was added to the FBI list, and the search for this creep continues. Moving on to number 2, Mark Putnam. In the mid-1980s, Mark Putnam was a happy husband, father, and successful FBI agent. But after relocating to the Bureau's Pikeville office, things began to change. At this time, Carl Edwards Lockhart, a notorious bank robber, had just been let out of prison, and Putnam believed that he was back to his old ways. So he began gathering informants that could help him take down Lockhart. One of these informants was Susan Smith, drug-addicted divorcee raising a family who needed the cash. But soon, she became more than just Putnam's informant. The two began an affair, and by 1989, Smith was allegedly pregnant. This terrified Putnam. He knew it would not only ruin his marriage, but end his career, and so he demanded a paternity test and explained he and his wife could adopt from her. This, however, led to a violent fight between them that ultimately ended with Putnam strangling Susan to death. Initially, the suspect was Susan's ex-husband, but soon Putnam was interrogated, and after failing a polygraph, he confessed to the whole thing and offered to lead the FBI to where she was. However, there are a few mysteries. Susan Smith's sister claimed that FBI agent Ron Poole, Putnam's superior, not only knew about Smith's alleged pregnancy, but also disclosed to Smith information about Putnam's illicit activities with other informants. And allegedly, medical examiners claimed that they were unable to find any trace of a fetus during an autopsy on Smith, who should have been 4 months pregnant. I mean, it's just all disturbing top to bottom. And last up in our number 1 spot, the Brianna Dennison case. Brianna Dennison was a college student home for the holidays in Reno, Nevada, when tragically one night she went missing while staying over at a friend's house. In the days following, the Reno Police Department conducted an investigation at her friend's home where she had last been seen and concluded she had been abducted after discovering male DNA on a doorknob and her own on a pillowcase. At this point, the FBI became involved in the search, and after investigations linked the male DNA to other open cases involving sexually violent crimes, they worried that the missing girl's fate had already been decided. And sadly, nearly a month after she had gone missing, Brianna was found dead in a ditch. That fall, after lengthy investigations, interrogations, and DNA samples, they finally found the man guilty of the crime, James Biella. And it came out that he had actually held her captive in his home for several days, harming and doing awful things to her body before he eventually killed her. And to top it off, he lived 1 block from FBI agents, 2 sheriffs, and a local police officer. So he was literally doing it all under their nose.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Red. This one comes from Gordzilla on Reddit. He said he once checked into a hotel a few kilometers from Kiev in Ukraine. It was very late and he was very tired. After booking a room at the desk, he was given a room number key. The woman at the desk stopped him as he went up the stairs. "One more thing," she said. "There is one room here without a number on that floor. It's always locked. Don't look in there." He nodded sleepily and headed upstairs, falling asleep instantly on his bed. He awoke though in the middle of the night to the sound of trickling water. It was coming from the room on the other side of the hallway. He opened the door and saw the room opposite was the exact same one that had no number. He opened the door and saw the room opposite was the one that had no number. Ignoring the woman's advice, he banged on the door. No response. He tried again. No response. He looked in the keyhole and saw nothing but red, just a deep, hazy scarlet. The water was still trickling. He went down to the front desk to complain. The woman's face dropped. She told him slowly that there was nobody in that room ever since the murder. A woman was killed in there by her husband many years ago. Her skin was pale, her hair dark brown, and her eyes, when she died, were a red, a deep, hazy scarlet. Next up at number 9 now, we have Morse code. This one comes from Confra. He said he once lived in a small building in the middle of his city. He ended up moving out because of a strange man who lived across the hallway. The man mostly kept to himself, but around midnight there was always a strange noise coming from his apartment. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. It was a bumping sound, like someone walking around in heels, but muffled, as if someone was trying to keep it quiet. After a few days, he realized the pattern was always the same, like a record playing over and over again. It went on for weeks, then months, then almost a full year, always the same bumps for hours at night. It was only years later, living somewhere else, that something clicked. He was helping his daughter with homework. She was learning about Morse code. She knocked on the table with her knuckles and a shiver ran down his spine. He recognized it as the pattern he had heard all those years ago. When he asked her what it meant, she laughed. "That's the easiest one, Daddy," she said. "It's the one to call for help." Moving on to number 8 now, we have Charlie. This one comes from Reddit user Horror in Pure Form. I'm just going to read this one exactly as they wrote it because it really deserves it. "I hate it when my brother Charlie has to go away. My parents constantly try to explain to me how sick he is, that I am lucky for having a brain where all the chemicals flow properly to their destinations like undammed rivers. When I complain about how bored I am without a little brother to play with, they try to make me feel bad by pointing out that his boredom likely far surpasses mine, considering he's confined to a dark room in an institution. I always beg for them to give him one last chance. Of course, they did at first. Charlie has been back home several times, each shorter in duration than the last. Every time without fail, it all starts again. The neighborhood cats with gouged out eyes showing up in his toy chest, my dad's razors found dropped on the baby slide in the park across the street, mom's vitamins replaced by bits of dishwater tablets. My parents are hesitant now, using last chances sparingly. They say his disorder makes him charming, makes it easy for him to fake normalcy, and to trick doctors who care for him into thinking he is ready for rehabilitation, that I will just have to put up with my boredom if it means staying safe from him. I hate it when Charlie has to go away. It makes me have to pretend to be good until he is back." Next up at number 7 now, we have Counting. This one was submitted to BuzzFeed. A man said his daughter woke him before midnight one night. He and his wife had picked her up from her friend Sally's birthday party earlier that night, brought her home and put her to bed. His wife went into the bedroom to read to her while he fell asleep watching the game. He awoke to feel his daughter tugging on his shirt sleeve. "Daddy," she said, "guess how old I'm going to be next month?" "I don't know, honey," he said as he slipped on his glasses. "How old?" She smiled and held up 4 fingers. The parents stayed up all night asking their daughter the same question for hours, but she refused to tell them where she got those 4 fingers from. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Guardians. This is a story from Dark Alligator. One day, a man awoke to a huge insect-like creature looming over his bed. It twitched and jerked its head, staring right down at him. He screamed and ran out of the room. When he sheepishly came back though, the insect was gone. That didn't make sleeping again easier though, and he stayed up all night wondering if it was a dream. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to see one of the huge insects placing a plate filled with food on the floor. It then backed away from him. He ate the food, confused but content. Perhaps this was the beginning of a bizarre relationship? As well as cooking, the creatures poured baths for him and began to tuck him into bed. He began to worry they were fattening him up. After one greasy breakfast gave him heartburn though, they actually replaced it with fruit. It seemed that they cared about him. One night, he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by the insects. They were protecting him. One morning, the creatures wouldn't let him leave his bedroom. He lay down on the bed, confused but trusting them. After hours of lying there, he felt a pain through his body. It felt like his stomach was full of razor wire and it was somehow moving. The insects chittered excitedly among themselves as his pain got worse. It was only when his skin began to bulge that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him, they had been protecting their young. Moving on to number 5 now, we have The Sound of Silence. This one comes from Reddit user Doverhawk. She said after a lifetime of being deaf, her best friend just received cochlear implants. When he woke up from the surgery, they all stood around him. His wife was the first one to say anything. He heard her voice and at once began to cry. They all took turns speaking, letting him hear their voices and names, and with each word they said, he became more emotional. When they were all finished, silence hung in the room. He looked up at her and asked her what that sound was. It took a moment to understand what he was saying, and when she understood, she told him that he was hearing silence. He shook his head. "This isn't silence," he said slowly, hearing his own voice for the first time. "I've been hearing silence all my life, and this is different." A sound came from just outside the hospital room, and he perked up immediately. "Isn't that silence?" They all exchanged looks of trepidation around the room before she spoke. "No," she said slowly, "that was the sound of someone screaming." Moving on to number 4 now, we have Mother. This one comes from Reddit user Whoever Fights Monsters. She said that when she and her sister Betsy were kids, their family lived for a while in an old farmhouse. They loved exploring the dusty corners and climbing the apple tree in the backyard. Their favourite part was the ghost in the house. They named her Mother because she seemed kind and nurturing. Some mornings she and Betsy would wake up and find a cup of tea by their beds. They felt the ghost had left them there, worried that they would get thirsty in the night. Among the houses farmhouse's original furnishings was an antique wooden chair, which they kept against the back wall of the living room. Whenever they were watching TV or playing a game, Mother would inch the chair forward towards them. Sometimes she managed to move it all the way to the very middle of the room. They always felt sad putting it back against the wall, as they felt Mother just wanted to be near to them. Years later, long after they moved out, they found an old newspaper article about the farmhouse's original occupants. One of them was a widow who murdered her 2 children by giving them each a cup of poisoned milk before bed. Then she hung herself. The article included a photo of the farmhouse's living room with the woman's body hanging from a beam. Beneath her, knocked over, was the same old wooden chair placed right in the middle of the room. Next to number 3 now, we have the wallpaper. This one comes from Reddit user Bat Out of Hell 821. She said that her and her boyfriend once bought an old house. He took control of any new construction that was needed, converting a kitchen into the master bedroom for example. She was on wallpaper removal duty and had her work cut out. The previous owner had covered every single wall and ceiling. Removing it was a real chore, but she got into the rhythm of it eventually. It began to feel satisfying, like peeling off a sunburn. She began to play a game, seeing what the longest piece she could peel off was before it finally ripped. She noticed that under a corner section of paper in every single room was a person's name and a date. Curiosity got the better of her one night and she decided to Google one of the names and discovered that the person was actually a missing person. The name and the date matched perfectly. She didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, she made a list of all the names and dates. Her face got paler with each name that matched with a missing person. They called the police, who cornered off the whole area. She overheard 2 of the officers talking in one of the rooms. One said, "Yeah, it's definitely human." "Human?" she asked. "What's human?" "Ma'am," they said, "what you were peeling off the walls wasn't newspaper. We're going to give this all to the coroner." Next to number 2 now, we have Seeing Dad. This is a great story from the General G on Reddit. Real or not, it's very creepy, and he told it like this. "Every day I see my father at work. He pretends like he doesn't see me, but I know he does. I try to do the same. But that doesn't really pan out well either. When you're at work, you gotta be on top of your game. So I do my best to just get on with what I'm supposed to do and get my job done. I can feel him watching me. Good. I want him to see how different I am from him. I'm not in your shadow. I'm my own person. I know what you're wondering. Do others know that he is my old man? Hard to say really. If they don't, I have no plans to correct them. If they do, well, there is nothing I can do about it. We are all under the shadow of our parents for the duration of most of our lives, whether we like it or not. In some cases, it just happens to be more obvious than others. Our parents help us define who we are. It's only a question of whether you follow their example or run as fast as you can in the other direction. For example, if you have a drug abusing parent who happens to murder a newlywed couple that gets stranded on the side of the road when you are only 10 years old, that might make one inclined to perpetuate a similar kind of violence, or it might make you decide to be a prison guard, so that you can make sure they and others just like them can't do it anymore, much like I did. And finally, number 1 now, we have Giggle. This is another one submitted to Reddit by a woman who said that one night she rushed out of her house to catch the opening act at her local bar's music night. After a few drinks, she realized her phone wasn't in her pocket. She checked the table that they were sitting at, it wasn't there. She tried the bar, the bathrooms, no luck. In the end, she gave up and decided to use her friend's phone to call her own. After 2 short rings, someone answered. "Hello?" she said. The other end of the line was silent. Then she heard a low, raspy giggle before the phone hung up. The person didn't answer again. She eventually decided to just go home. When she got to her bedroom, there she found her phone, lying on the table by her bed, right where she had left it. Starting off at number 10 now, we have Leave. This one comes from a Reddit user who owes his life to a stranger or some supernatural force. See what you guys think. They say, "I was stationed in Seoul, South Korea several years ago. I was taking a shower in my room, and when I got out, the word leave was written in small letters in the fog on the bathroom mirror. I don't have a roommate because we get our own private rooms there. A little freaked out, I decided to do exactly that. I left. I went off for some Korean barbecue and wandered the city a bit. I came back a couple of hours later to find the barracks were evacuated and half burnt to the ground. The fire was pinpointed to faulty electrical wiring that caught some insulation on fire inside the walls. Someone or something knew that was going to happen, and to this day, whatever that something was, it didn't want me in the middle of it. I gladly thank who or whatever it is if they give me the chance, but it's been years and I still have no idea. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the figure. When you're a kid and you get creeped out at night, your parents may tell you it's just your imagination. But what if you found out that you were right the whole time? Reddit user Miss Awesomeness said, when I was a kid between 8 or 9, I used to wake up every night to headlights coming through my bedroom window. The lights would then stop and turn off, not as if a car drove by, but as if they were turned off. Then the long shadows of a man, as if he were looking through my window, would pass by and stop right in front of the window. I would lay really still and pretend nothing happened every night for months. Eventually I convinced myself it was my imagination. Now that I think back, it stopped when my stepdad moved in, but I was convinced it wasn't real. Across the street lived my best friend, whose mom was also single, and she refused to sleep in her bedroom. Her window faced my window. She told me years later it was because every night a man would park on her side yard and walk over to my yard. The long shadows were from the light in her yard. She eventually decided it was my dad checking in on us and never told me until I was a teenager. It wasn't my dad, I know that because I asked him, so I thought I was crazy and hallucinating for years, or perhaps I wasn't and two kids were having odd dreams at the same time every night. Coming out number 8 now, we have The Room. This one comes from a Reddit user who said, I work in hospice, I spend a lot of time around dying people. About a month and a half ago, one of my longer term clients was actively passing. Now that can involve hallucinating, seeing and talking to people who aren't actually there. It happens a lot. There's nothing wrong with it. It's the dying person's brain trying to grasp with their new reality. So I work overnights. My client was wide awake, talking to people who were in the room with her but who weren't in the room with me, which was fine. I'm okay with that. Until she started describing people I knew who had passed. I almost quit my job that night and told myself I wouldn't return to her. Most of the rest of her hospice care team started quitting in the next few days, and I ended up staying with her until the very end. That one weird night was the only time she was talking to my dead family members. I'm still kind of messed up over it. Next up, number 7 now, we have The Creature. Do you guys believe in Bigfoot? We've talked about that a lot in urban legend videos. Is this story related to that? Reddit user The Glitter Band said, I get insomnia. It was one of those nights and I was sitting out on my back porch at about 4 AM smoking a cigarette. It was one of these eerie nights where there is absolutely no breeze and it's just completely quiet out. We have woods behind our house, and as I was sitting there, I see this person making his way through the canopy of the trees, like jumping from tree to tree, 30 or 40 feet up in the air. I was absolutely stunned and just sat there, dumbly too afraid and confused to even get up and run inside the house. This person or thing or whatever it was stopped directly behind my house and looked at me. At this point it's about 50 feet away and maybe 40 feet up in the air. It pauses for about 5 seconds staring in my direction. I'm absolutely certain that it wasn't an animal. Its body was human shaped and it definitely wasn't a raccoon, bear or any of the other things people might have suggested it was. But the way it was moving through the trees definitely was not human. No human, I don't care how fit they are, could move like that. It was too dark to make out that much detail of the face, clothing or anything like that. After about 5 seconds of looking at me, it turns away and takes off the same way it had been going before, just leaping from tree to tree at a fast pace. Within a few more seconds, it was out of sight. Moving on to number 6 now, we have True or False. This one comes from Reddit user The Ambush Bug. I'm going to jump right into it and we'll discuss it after. They said, in 4th or 5th grade, we stopped all of our classes for the day. 2 people came into our classroom, a man and a woman, and they didn't say why they were there or where they had come from. They handed out questionnaire booklets that seemed like standardized tests, except for the questions within them. 50 or so questions, all of them true or false format, but with really weird content. Some that I can remember were true or false, worms talk to trucks, and true or false, apples are blue. We all answered them while looking really confused, and our teachers were silent the entire time. The next day, nobody said a word about the test. I remember asking people what they were, but nobody could recall where the people were from. We never saw them again, and no faculty of the school ever once mentioned a test. We didn't have them the next year and had never had them before. I still have no clue what they wanted from us. Alright, what is going on there, guys? That sounds like something out of a movie, like some sort of creepy CIA stuff. Moving on to number 5 now, we have teleportation. Do you guys believe that teleportation can happen? This story makes it sound like you just have to believe really hard to make it happen. Reddit user Evangelina1021 said, I always always remember this and do not have an explanation for it. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and walking to the stairs. I remember closing my eyes for a second at the top of the stairs, and when I opened them, I would be at the bottom of the stairs. I would run upstairs and close my eyes, and the same thing would happen again. It happened at least 4 or 5 times until my parents called me to go to bed because they could hear me run up the stairs. It's weird because I was totally wide awake and do not have a history with sleepwalking. I still think about it and wonder how that was possible. Next up at number 4 now, we have the boats. This one comes from Reddit user Risa, and if you can solve this mystery, guys, there's a massive monetary reward for you at the end of it. I'm serious, you're about to see why. They said, my uncle never had a chance to meet him, hired a small yacht with a small group of friends and were going to use it to do sailing holidays as a business. Anyway, they radioed in very early one morning saying they were out of petrol off the coast and were told they would receive petrol in the morning. They went to deliver petrol and never found the boat. They have only ever found one life donut ring, and that's it. They think the boat was pirated, and we have reports that they're still alive in different countries, but they've never been substantiated. They also have a sneaking suspicion that the yacht owner had something to do with it, as he acted so dodgy after it all went down. They literally have absolutely no idea what happened. There were no other ships in the area at the time. They thought they could have been run over and sank by a larger ship. Anyway, it's called the Patanela. There is still a huge reward out for any info. Coming in number 3 now, we have pizza time. This one comes from Reddit user Math the username, who said, I was 18 and my brother Chris was 16. I also have a brother James who was 5 at the time. We had just moved into an older house that used to be 3 apartments. We just about finished unpacking and we designated rooms. James's room was directly above the living room with a staircase. James went up to discover his new room, and Chris and I took a short walk around the neighborhood. We got back and were sitting in the living room just talking. My mom says she's going to get pizza for dinner and leaves. She took a fairly long time, which is normal for her. I think she really enjoys the small breaks she gets when she can leave the house without James, and I never object to babysitting. Besides, James is plenty occupied with his new room. Chris and I are just talking in the living room. James is super excited about his new room. We hear him running and stomping around upstairs, opening and closing doors. Sometimes he slams the doors pretty hard, but whatever, he's a kid. I assumed he fell asleep since the noise stopped eventually. I hear my mom's car pull up. I get up to meet her in the kitchen. My mom comes in carrying soda. James follows directly behind her carrying the food, yelling pizza time. She took him with her to get dinner. Chris and I just looked at each other, taking way too long to comprehend what was happening and what was making that noise upstairs. Next up at number 2 now, we have John. This one is just straight up creepy. If they are telling the truth about the details of this story, then I have no idea what the explanation is. Reddit user CatGib13 said, when my son was about 2 or 3, he wouldn't go to sleep, so I let him in my bed. My husband was asleep, so I told my boy he had to look at his books quietly when I read mine. He was good for a bit, but then he started reading the book, actually reading the words out loud, slowly. Now he couldn't read, and it was never a book we had read to him yet. It wasn't memorization. I asked him how he knew what it said, and he replied, my friend John is telling me. He talked to John whenever he played. He divided his Matchbox cars into 2 piles and talked to his friend. He also claimed he lived in his nursery closet. At age 4, we moved him into his big boy room, and now that he's 16, he refuses to even step into the nursery. He hasn't been in there since we moved him out. When I ask why, he says he doesn't know, but it gives him the creeps and the hairs on his arm stand up even thinking about it. That doesn't bother anyone else. I don't actually know what the explanation for that story is. Maybe the kid could read better than they thought, or maybe the spirit of a dead man called John was reading out loud to him at night. I hope it's the first one. And finally, number 1 now, we have Ernie. Do any of you guys have those toys that talk when you press a button on them or move in front of them? Did you ever think they could be creepy? Well, you're about to, after this story from Reddit user LXNXB. They said, when I was a kid, I had lots and lots of plushies. One of them was a talking Ernie doll from Sesame Street that wasn't functioning properly. You had to absolutely bang it on a table for it to say, I feel great. Our old house in my home country was housed with spirits, but not bad ones, or at least that's what my parents said. I never witnessed or felt anything until this one time. When I was 8, I overheard my parents saying something along the lines that my Ernie plushie spoke every time they talked about my grandma. I got irrationally scared, which made my parents hide Ernie in a huge box along with my other unused plushies. One time, while I was playing hide and seek, I was hiding with my childhood friend Jay in our spare room where the box of plushies were. While we were hiding, I figured I might as well tell him the story about the haunted Ernie doll and my just recently passed away grandma. In the middle of the story, we hear Ernie say, "I feel great," in the box on top of the shelf. There's no way that was moved, and even if it was somehow moved by gravity, you need to bang Ernie on the table to even make it talk. We screamed and ran outside.
Want even more creepy videos? Well, check out this video next. It's about statues that were caught moving on camera. Click the video now to find out more. You won't regret it.